In an unprecedented move that sent shockwaves across the globe, the long-simmering tensions between the United States and Venezuela erupted into open conflict on January 3, 2026. The day began with a stunning development that would rewrite the rules of international engagement. Just before dawn, residents of Caracas were jolted awake by a series of powerful explosions. Initial reports described blasts targeting key government infrastructure and military installations, suggesting a meticulously planned operation that left the city in a state of confusion and fear. Within hours, Washington claimed responsibility. The Trump administration officially characterized the event not as an act of war, but as a large-scale precision strike. A statement from the Pentagon cited credible intelligence of imminent threats to U.S. national security interests as the primary justification for the preemptive action. This dramatic military intervention did not occur in a vacuum. It followed years of escalating diplomatic hostility, crippling economic sanctions imposed by the U.S., and a tense naval blockade that had severely restricted trade and movement in the Caribbean. The most audacious element of the operation was yet to be revealed. In a coordinated special forces raid, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were captured at a secure location. They were swiftly extracted from the country and transported to New York, a historic and controversial first in U.S. foreign policy. The international reaction was swift and divided. The Organization of American States called for an emergency session, while the United Nations Security Council prepared for a contentious debate. Allies expressed concern over the unilateral action, while adversaries condemned it as a flagrant violation of international law. The legal and diplomatic ramifications are immense. Questions of jurisdiction, the legitimacy of the capture, and the precedent set by detaining a sitting head of state on foreign soil now dominate global headlines, creating a complex challenge for international diplomacy. On the ground in Venezuela, a state of uncertainty prevails. Airports remain closed, and a heavy military presence is visible on the streets of major cities. While some anti-Maduro demonstrations have emerged, the broader population faces a deeply uncertain future. In the coming days, the world will be watching for further statements from the White House, the first court appearances for Maduro and Flores, and the response from Venezuela's remaining government and military leaders. As the situation develops, the long-term consequences of this bold action remain profoundly unclear.
In the deep stillness of the pre-dawn hours, under the cloak of a moonless Caribbean sky, a meticulously planned and swiftly executed military operation began to unfold over Caracas, the sprawling capital of Venezuela. The city, home to millions, slept on, largely unaware that the geopolitical tensions simmering for years were about to boil over in a dramatic and decisive fashion. This was not a slow escalation, but a sudden, overwhelming show of force. According to initial international reporting, a multi-domain task force, primarily composed of United States assets, carried out a concentrated series of precision air and special operations strikes. The operation, codenamed for its swiftness, drew upon assets staged strategically throughout the region. From air bases in allied nations and naval carriers positioned in international waters, a complex web of aircraft and unmanned drones converged on their targets with digital precision. The coordination suggested weeks, if not months, of intensive intelligence gathering, logistical preparation, and rehearsal. Every movement was calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimal warning, exploiting the darkness and the element of surprise. The initial wave of the assault was surgical, designed to cripple the Venezuelan military's ability to respond. The primary targets were key military installations, including the Generalissimo Francisco de Miranda Air Base and other critical airfields around the capital. Simultaneously, strikes were directed at hardened command and control centers, severing the lines of communication between the nation's political leadership and its armed forces. The goal was clear: to create a state of strategic paralysis, rendering any organized defense impossible. This phase also included targeting early warning radar sites and anti-aircraft batteries, effectively blinding the regime and creating safe corridors for subsequent waves of the operation. On the ground, the first signs of the unfolding events for the city's residents were not visual, but auditory. Reports from across the capital described the sound of powerful rolling explosions echoing through the valleys and across the urban landscape. The deep percussive blasts were unlike the sounds of common urban life, immediately signaling an event of extraordinary and violent significance. Eyewitnesses in different districts reported seeing the sky light up with brief, intense flashes, followed moments later by the shock waves that rattled windows and shook buildings. These explosions were almost immediately followed by widespread power outages. The strikes had not only targeted military infrastructure, but also key nodes of the national power grid. This plunged vast sections of Caracas and surrounding areas into darkness and confusion. The sudden loss of electricity was compounded by a near-total collapse of communications. Cellular networks went dead, internet access vanished, and television and radio broadcasts were replaced by static. This information blackout was a deliberate tactic, designed to prevent the dissemination of official government orders and to sow uncertainty among the population and the military rank and file. For millions, the world shrank to what they could see from their windows and hear from their neighbors. Encyclopedia Britannica.
From a strategic standpoint, this appears to have been a classic decapitation strike, but one executed with a level of speed, scale, and technological integration that is truly unprecedented. The primary objective in such an operation is always to neutralize a regime's senior leadership and its ability to command and control its forces. You essentially remove the head of the snake. By doing so, you aim to create a power vacuum and induce a rapid collapse of the existing command structure, theoretically preventing a cohesive, organized resistance. The idea is to make the conflict decisive and short, bypassing the immense costs of a prolonged war. It's an exceptionally high-risk, high-reward strategy. The potential reward is avoiding a protracted ground invasion and the catastrophic human and economic costs that come with it. You sidestep months or years of grueling urban warfare. However, the risks are immense. If you fail to completely neutralize the command structure, or if second-tier leaders manage to rally loyalist forces, you could inadvertently trigger the very civil war you sought to prevent. Furthermore, the risk of creating a chaotic and uncontrolled power vacuum on the ground is substantial. Without a clear and immediate plan for succession and stabilization, you can unleash factional violence, widespread looting, and a severe humanitarian crisis. The first few hours are critical. The follow-through is everything. Vogue on today.
As news of the operation broke across the globe, the international reaction was swift, sharp, and deeply divided. In Latin America, the response was a mixture of alarm and condemnation. Several neighboring governments, including key regional players, immediately called for an emergency session of the Organization of American States. Their statements expressed grave concern over what they termed a flagrant violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and a dangerous precedent for the region. They warned of the potential for a wider destabilization that could trigger refugee flows and cross-border conflict. Other global powers issued cautious statements, calling for restraint and a de-escalation of hostilities, while awaiting further clarity on the situation. Meanwhile, global energy markets reacted with predictable volatility. Venezuela, despite its recent economic collapse, remains a founding member of OPEC and sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves. The prospect of a major disruption to its production and exports, however diminished, sent immediate shockwaves through the commodities markets. Brent crude futures jumped several percentage points within the first hour of trading, as traders priced in the new geopolitical risk and the potential for instability to spread to other major oil-producing regions. Then, just hours after the initial strikes, came the stunning confirmation from the highest level of the U.S. government. In a move that bypassed traditional diplomatic and military channels, U.S. President Donald Trump announced via a post on social media that Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, the influential politician Celia Flores, had been captured. The blunt and informal nature of the announcement added to the surreal quality of the morning's events, delivering a geopolitical bombshell in under 280 characters. The post claimed the operation was a success and that the primary targets were secure. The social media post went on to state that both Maduro and Flores were in the process of being transported directly to New York. It specified they were to be held at a federal detention center pending their arraignment in court. This detail was extraordinary, signaling an intention not just to depose a foreign leader, but to subject him to the U.S. justice system. The logistics of such an extraction, moving high-value detainees from a live conflict zone across international airspace to a maximum security facility in downtown Manhattan, are staggering, underscoring the depth of the operation's planning. The legal basis for this unprecedented action, as cited by U.S. officials, is a 2020 indictment from the Department of Justice. That indictment charges Nicolás Maduro and other high-ranking Venezuelan officials with a slate of serious crimes, including narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine into the United States, and possession of machine guns and destructive devices. The charges allege that Maduro and his inner circle conspired with the FARC, a designated terrorist group, to flood the United States with cocaine and use the drug trade as a weapon against America. It is crucial to note that these are charges that President Maduro's government and its international allies have consistently and vehemently denounced. For years, they have characterized the U.S. indictments and sanctions as baseless political maneuvering and a form of economic warfare. They argue the accusations are a fabricated pretext, designed to justify an illegal intervention and seize control of Venezuela's vast oil wealth. This narrative of imperialist aggression has been a cornerstone of Maduro's domestic and foreign policy, and it now forms the central counter-argument to the legality of his capture and impending trial. As the first rays of sunlight begin to crest the mountains surrounding a tense and profoundly uncertain Caracas, the world is left to grapple with the consequences. The full political, diplomatic, and humanitarian fallout of this dramatic military action is only just beginning to be understood. On the streets of the capital, a new and unpredictable chapter has begun, while in a detention cell thousands of miles away, a legal battle with historic implications is about to commence. The story is far from over. In many ways, it has just begun.
Chapter 1. The Unfolding Crisis. The capture of Nicolás Maduro was not a sudden, isolated event. It was the explosive culmination of a long and complex geopolitical drama, a story of power, pressure, and petroleum that had been unfolding for years. To understand the final act, we must first examine the stage on which it was set. A nation of immense natural wealth, yet crippled by internal strife and external pressures. Venezuela, home to the world's largest proven oil reserves, had become a focal point of international contention. Its government, led by Maduro, faced widespread accusations of authoritarianism, corruption, and human rights abuses. In response, the United States, under successive administrations, had embarked on a campaign of maximum pressure, designed to isolate the regime and force a political transition. This campaign was not fought with armies on a traditional battlefield, but in the corridors of power, on the high seas, and within the global financial system. It was a new kind of warfare, one whose weapons were sanctions, blockades, and information. This is the story of how that pressure cooker was built, piece by piece, until it finally exploded. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Sanctions. The strategy began years earlier, but it intensified dramatically. The U.S. Treasury Department became a key battleground. Starting in 2017, the Trump administration unleashed a torrent of executive orders, methodically cutting off the Venezuelan government's access to the U.S. financial system. These weren't just targeted sanctions against individuals accused of corruption. They were broad, sectoral sanctions aimed at the heart of the Venezuelan economy. The first major blow targeted new debt and equity issued by the Venezuelan government and its state oil company, PDVSA. This effectively locked Caracas out of most international capital markets. Then came sanctions directly on PDVSA itself, freezing its assets in the U.S. and prohibiting American companies from doing business with it. This was a seismic move, as the U.S. had been the largest customer for Venezuelan crude oil. The stated goal was to deny the Maduro regime the revenues it needed to survive. But the impact was far broader, creating a chilling effect that scared off non-U.S. companies as well, for fear of secondary sanctions. The web of restrictions grew increasingly complex, targeting the central bank, the mining sector, and any entity, foreign or domestic, deemed to be providing material support to the government. Each new measure was another turn of the screw, tightening the economic vice around the nation. Chapter 3. The Maritime Front. As financial avenues closed, the physical world became the next front. The pressure campaign moved to the high seas. Over the last year, the U.S. steadily ramped up its military and intelligence presence in the Caribbean. The official justification was a vast, enhanced counter-narcotics operation. The Pentagon framed it as a necessary measure to disrupt drug trafficking routes they alleged were being exploited by the Maduro regime and other transnational criminal organizations. This led to a sharp increase in naval patrols, surveillance flights, and interdictions. The first overt strike came in December 2025. Citing intelligence that a specific coastal port was being used as a logistics hub for drug networks, a CIA-led operation resulted in a targeted strike. The Venezuelan government decried it as an act of terrorism and a violation of its sovereignty. Washington maintained it was a legitimate counter-narcotics action. This incident marked a significant escalation, moving from economic pressure to direct, albeit limited, military force. It blurred the lines between law enforcement and acts of war, setting a dangerous precedent for the months to come. Following the port strike, the Trump administration ordered what it called a total and complete blockade of oil tankers moving to and from Venezuela. This was the logical and most severe extension of the economic sanctions. If Venezuela couldn't be stopped from producing oil, perhaps it could be stopped from selling it. U.S. naval forces, already deployed for the counter-narcotics mission, were tasked with enforcing this new directive. They began to intercept, board, and seize vessels suspected of violating the sanctions. The seizures were legally contentious. The U.S. justified them under its domestic laws, but many of the ships were flagged in other countries and owned by international corporations. The actions created a high-stakes game of cat and mouse in the Caribbean, with tankers attempting to evade detection by turning off their transponders or using illicit ship-to-ship transfers. The blockade was not just about oil. It was a powerful symbol of American dominance and a direct challenge to Venezuelan sovereignty. Critics labeled it a modern-day piracy, a form of economic warfare that punished not just the government, but the entire population. Chapter 4. Condemnation and International Law. The maritime campaign quickly drew international condemnation. The reported death toll from dozens of maritime strikes since September, which U.S. officials often attributed to resisting interdiction or accidental explosions, climbed over 100. These incidents, often involving smaller vessels and not just large tankers, brought the human cost of the blockade into sharp focus. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a scathing report labeling the unilateral sanctions and the ensuing blockade as violations of international law. The report argued that the measures were having a devastating impact on the civilian population's access to food, medicine, and essential services, amounting to a form of collective punishment. At the UN Security Council, Russia and China, key allies of Venezuela, accused the United States of aggressive unilateralism and of destabilizing the region for its own geopolitical and economic interests. They vetoed resolutions that would have legitimized the U.S. actions, leading to a diplomatic stalemate. European allies, while critical of the Maduro government, were also uneasy with the overt military nature of the blockade, urging a return to diplomacy and cautioning against actions that could lead to a wider conflict. The legal and diplomatic battles raged. but on the waters of the Caribbean, the U.S. Navy's mission continued unabated. Chapter 5: A Nation Under Siege. Inside Venezuela, the cumulative effect of sanctions and the blockade was catastrophic. The economy, already reeling from years of mismanagement, hyperinflation, and declining oil production, went into freefall. The blockade choked off the last remaining streams of state revenue, while also making it nearly impossible to import basic goods. Shortages of food, medicine, and gasoline became chronic. Power outages, once sporadic, became a daily reality in many parts of the country. The humanitarian crisis deepened, fueling a new wave of migration as millions fled the collapsing state. The government blamed the U.S. for waging an economic war and used the external pressure to rally its base, framing the struggle in nationalist terms. But for ordinary citizens, life became a daily struggle for survival. The sanctions, intended to punish the regime, were inflicting immense suffering on the very people they were ostensibly meant to help. This created a paradox. While the pressure weakened Maduro's government financially, it also allowed him to consolidate power by controlling the distribution of scarce resources and blaming an external enemy for the country's woes. The social fabric of the nation was tearing apart. Chapter 6: The Geopolitical Chessboard. The crisis was never confined to Venezuela's borders. It played out across a regional and global chessboard. Neighboring countries were deeply affected. Colombia and Brazil, both led by governments hostile to Maduro, bore the brunt of the refugee crisis and became key staging grounds for the U.S.-led pressure campaign. Their borders became militarized zones, rife with tension and sporadic clashes between Venezuelan forces and irregular armed groups. Further afield, Cuba remained a staunch ideological and intelligence ally for Maduro, while Russia and China provided crucial economic and diplomatic lifelines. They saw the U.S. actions as a playbook for regime change that could one day be used against them. They supplied Venezuela with loans, technical assistance for its oil industry, and allegedly military advisors. Iran, another U.S. adversary, defied the blockade by sending its own tankers loaded with fuel and other supplies to Venezuela, creating tense standoffs with the U.S. Navy in the process. The Venezuelan crisis became a proxy battleground for larger geopolitical rivalries, a place where the U.S., Russia, and China vied for influence in America's own backyard. Chapter 7: The Oil Equation. At the heart of the entire conflict was, and always has been, oil. Venezuela's vast reserves are a strategic prize. For the U.S., the campaign was framed as being about democracy and narcotics, but opponents consistently argued it was about controlling this immense energy resource and squeezing a competitor out of the market. The sanctions and blockade effectively removed hundreds of thousands and potentially millions of barrels of Venezuelan crude from the global supply. While other producers like Saudi Arabia and the U.S. itself could ramp up production to compensate, the removal of Venezuela's heavy crude disrupted a specific segment of the market, particularly for U.S. Gulf Coast refineries designed to process it. The official U.S. position was that the pressure was necessary to disrupt the flow of blood oil that funded an illegitimate regime. Officials framed the entire operation as a matter of national security, aimed at disrupting narcotics trafficking and restoring democracy. However, critics, including many within the U.S. and the international community, saw a more cynical motive. They argued that the ultimate goal was to destabilize the Maduro government to a point where a more U.S.-friendly administration could take over, one that would open up Venezuela's oil sector to foreign investment and align its production with American interests. The debate was fierce. Was it a crusade for freedom or a calculated play for black gold? Chapter 8: The War of Narratives. Alongside the economic and military pressure, a fierce information war was being waged. Both sides sought to control the narrative. The U.S. and its allies portrayed Maduro as a corrupt dictator, a narco-trafficker who had starved his own people. Every action, from sanctions to the blockade, was framed as a step toward liberating the Venezuelan people. Pro-government media and its international allies, meanwhile, painted a picture of imperialist aggression. They depicted the US as a global bully seeking to steal Venezuela's oil and crush its socialist revolution. Every shortage, every power outage was blamed on the American blockade and economic war. In this polarized environment, objective truth became a casualty. Reports were contradictory, facts were contested, and social media became a battleground for bots and propaganda. Was the port strike a legitimate counter-drug operation or an illegal act of aggression? Were the tanker seizures a necessary enforcement of sanctions or modern-day piracy? The answer depended entirely on which news channel you watched or which government you believed. This war of words was crucial as it shaped public opinion both domestically and internationally, providing the political cover needed for the escalating actions on the ground. Chapter 9. The final buildup. All these threads, the crippling sanctions, the naval blockade, the international condemnation, the humanitarian crisis, and the information war, wove together in the final months, creating an environment of extreme volatility. The pressure had reached its maximum setting. The Venezuelan state was hollowed out, its military's loyalty tested, and its population exhausted. For policymakers in Washington, the calculus seemed to be that the regime was brittle enough to shatter with one final, decisive push. That buildup, a year-long campaign of relentless, escalating pressure from every conceivable angle, set the stage for the military operation that ended with Maduro's capture. It was the culmination of a strategy that had systematically dismantled a nation's economy and sovereignty in pursuit of a specific geopolitical outcome. The raid itself may have been the final chapter, but the story was written over months of calculated moves in a high-stakes conflict that blurred the lines between peace and war. The question that remains is not just how it happened, but what comes next for a nation brought to its knees.
In the pre-dawn hours, the relative quiet of Caracas was shattered. A series of explosions, later confirmed as a targeted U.S. military operation against the Miraflores presidential palace, plunged the Venezuelan capital into a state of profound uncertainty. In the immediate aftermath, as the first light of day crept over the Avila Mountains, residents across the sprawling city reported a mixture of shock, confusion, and palpable fear. The sounds had been jarring, waking many from their sleep. What followed was an unnerving silence, a quiet that felt heavier and more menacing than the usual morning calm. The city held its breath, waiting. Initial reports were fragmented, spreading through text messages and hurried phone calls before communication networks became congested. Across the city's districts, from the working-class barrios of Petare to the more affluent neighborhoods of Chacao, the experience was universal. A sudden, violent disruption followed by a void of information. This information vacuum quickly became a source of anxiety in itself. Rumors began to circulate, but official news was slow to emerge, leaving millions to piece together the night's events from whispers and the unsettling stillness outside their windows. As the sun rose higher, the city's paralysis became visible. The typically bustling streets remained eerily empty. Shops and churches closed, their metal shutters pulled down and locked. Public transportation, the lifeblood of the capital, ground to a halt. The Caracas Metro, which normally moves over 2 million people a day, suspended all services. On the surface streets, the ubiquitous buses were nowhere to be seen. Government offices and schools announced they would not open. Caracas, a metropolis of constant motion and noise, had fallen silent and still. Many citizens were unsure whether celebrations would erupt in some quarters, given the deep political divisions and economic hardships that have marked the nation for years. There was a tense anticipation, a question hanging in the air about how the populace would react. Would this be a moment of catharsis for opponents of the government, or a moment that would rally supporters? But any potential for public gatherings, whether in protest or celebration, was quickly extinguished by an overriding sense of caution. Fear of reprisals from state security forces and the sheer uncertainty of the situation kept public reactions subdued. People stayed indoors, watching from their balconies and windows, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and exhaustion.
We heard the explosions. It was loud, like thunder, right on top of us. Then silence. A silence that was worse than the noise. My children woke up crying. I told them it was just a storm, but they knew. They could feel it. I tried to call my sister who lives across the city, but the call would not connect. I sent a message. I don't know if she received it. We turned on the radio, searching for news, any news. For hours there was nothing but music then. Then the official statements began. Everyone is scared. Nobody knows what comes next. Will there be food tomorrow? Will it be safe to go outside? We just don't know.
By mid-morning, the Maduro government, though its leader's fate was unconfirmed, began to reassert its authority. Through a broadcast on state television channel VTV, the Ministry of Defense issued a statement. Flanked by high-ranking military officials, Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez declared a nationwide state of emergency. He denounced the U.S. operation as a cowardly imperialist attack and an act of war against the sovereignty of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The government's messaging was clear and defiant, framing the attack as foreign aggression and calling for national unity against a common enemy. With President Nicolas Maduro's status and whereabouts unknown, questions of constitutional succession immediately came to the forefront. In an emergency session, the Supreme Tribunal of Justice, Venezuela's highest court, moved swiftly. Citing articles of the Constitution related to the absolute absence of the president, the court named Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as interim president. The court's ruling provided a veneer of legal continuity, an attempt to project stability and a clear chain of command amidst the chaos. In her first address to the nation, broadcast from a secure, undisclosed location, interim President Rodriguez adopted a tone of resolute defiance. She vowed resistance against what she termed a criminal violation of international law. She called on the Bolivarian National Armed Forces to defend the nation's sovereignty and urged citizens to remain calm but vigilant. Her speech was a declaration that the government, despite the attack, remained in control and would not capitulate. She promised that the perpetrators and their internal collaborators would face justice, a statement that did little to ease the fears of reprisals among the population. The international reaction was swift and polarized. Allies of the Maduro government, including Russia, China, and Cuba, condemned the U.S. military action, calling it a flagrant breach of the United Nations Charter. Russia's foreign ministry warned of the most serious consequences for regional and global security. Conversely, a number of nations that had previously recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the legitimate leader of Venezuela reacted with caution, calling for a peaceful and democratic transition while stopping short of explicitly endorsing the military strike. The United Nations Secretary-General called for maximum restraint and urged all parties to avoid any further escalation. The world was now watching Venezuela, with global powers aligning along familiar geopolitical fault lines. Back on the streets of Caracas, the political and geopolitical maneuvers felt distant. The primary concern for most was survival. The shutdown of the city had an immediate impact on the availability of essential goods. By afternoon, long queues began to form outside the few bakeries and small grocery stores that had dared to open for a limited time. With the banking system offline and digital payments failing, cash became king, but it was a currency few possessed in sufficient amounts. The specter of food and fuel shortages, already a chronic problem, now loomed larger and more immediate than ever. In the face of institutional collapse, however, informal networks of community support began to emerge. Neighbors who had previously been strangers shared information, checked on the elderly, and pooled resources. In some apartment buildings, residents organized to share stored water and food. These small acts of solidarity and mutual aid, born of necessity, stood in stark contrast to the official narrative of conflict and defiance. They were a testament to the resilience of a populace long accustomed to navigating crisis. As evening approached, The government announced a strict citywide curfew from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. to be enforced by the military and national police. The stated reason was to ensure security and prevent looting or disorder. For residents, it meant the city would once again be plunged into an enforced silence, confined to their homes to wait out the long, uncertain night. The day that began with a series of explosions was ending not with a bang, but with a lockdown, trapping the city in a state of suspended animation. It is crucial to place these events in context. The attack did not occur in a vacuum. It followed years of escalating tensions between Washington and Caracas, marked by severe economic sanctions, diplomatic breakdowns, and U.S. support for Venezuela's political opposition. Domestically, the nation has been grappling with a protracted economic collapse, hyperinflation, and a humanitarian crisis that has prompted millions to flee the country. The political landscape has been fiercely contested, with the legitimacy of the government challenged both internally and externally. This military action represents a dramatic and dangerous escalation in a long simmering conflict, the consequences of which are only beginning to unfold. As a new day dawns over Caracas, the city remains on edge. The immediate shock has given way to a grim reality of military patrols, shuttered businesses, and a deeply uncertain future. The questions on everyone's mind are the same. What happens now? What will the government's next move be? And how will the lives of ordinary Venezuelans, already strained to the breaking point, be further reshaped by the events of the last 24 hours? The path forward for Venezuela is shrouded in fog, as its people and the world await the next chapter. In the immediate aftermath of the strike, the world's response was not merely swift. It was a deafening chorus of condemnation that reverberated through the halls of power across every continent. The incident acted as a geopolitical flashpoint, sending shockwaves through the intricate web of international relations. The core principles that have governed state interactions for centuries, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the prohibition of unilateral force, were thrust into the global spotlight. Diplomats, heads of state, and international bodies were compelled to react, their statements and communiques painting a complex picture of a world grappling with a brazen challenge to established norms. The initial hours were a flurry of diplomatic activity. Phones rang in foreign ministries from Brasilia to Beijing. Emergency consultations were convened, and ambassadors were summoned to explain and to be admonished. The digital sphere exploded with official statements, each word carefully chosen, yet collectively forming an overwhelming wave of criticism. This was not a localized dispute. It was an event with profound global implications, and the international community reacted with the gravity it deserved. The central question on everyone's mind was not just about the act itself, but about the precedent it could set. If one nation's borders could be violated with such impunity, whose would be next? This fear, this fundamental concern for the stability of the international order, fueled the intensity and the near unanimity of the global reaction. Nowhere was the reaction more immediate or more visceral than in Venezuela's own backyard. The governments of Latin America, a region with a long and painful history of foreign intervention, spoke with a near unified voice. They condemned the strike as a flagrant violation of Venezuela's sovereignty and a dangerous escalation of regional tensions. The Organization of American States, the region's primary multilateral forum, became a hotbed of debate, with member states issuing urgent calls for dialogue and de-escalation. The sentiment was clear. Regardless of the deep political and ideological divisions that have characterized the region in recent years, the principle of non-intervention was held as sacrosanct. For these nations, the attack was not an isolated incident, but a chilling echo of a past they had collectively strived to leave behind. It threatened to unravel decades of work aimed at building a region governed by diplomacy and mutual respect for national borders. The condemnation was therefore not just a political statement. It was a defense of their own sovereignty and a reaffirmation of the foundational principles of inter-American law. Brazil, the continent's largest nation, issued one of the most forceful rebukes. The Foreign Ministry in Brasilia released a statement describing the military action as a grave event and an unacceptable line crossed. This was more than just diplomatic boilerplate. For Brazil, which shares a more than 2,000-kilometer border with Venezuela, the strike represented a direct threat to regional stability. Brazilian diplomats emphasized that any action on Venezuelan soil, regardless of its justification, must have the consent of the Venezuelan state or explicit authorization from the United Nations Security Council. The statement from Brasilia was a clear signal that it would not tolerate unilateral military actions that could destabilize its northern frontier, a region already grappling with humanitarian challenges and the cross-border flow of refugees. The Brazilian government's position underscored a deep-seated belief in a rules-based order, labeling the strike a dangerous departure from the path of diplomacy and international law. Further north, Mexico and Colombia, two of the region's most influential diplomatic players, echoed these concerns, framing their response through the lens of international legality. Mexico, adhering to its long-standing Estrada doctrine of non-intervention, called for absolute respect for the norms that govern peaceful coexistence between nations. The Mexican Foreign Ministry urged all parties to seek resolutions through the established channels of international law and multilateral organizations, warning that the use of force is not the solution to disputes between states. Colombia's reaction was particularly pointed, given its complex and often fraught relationship with its neighbor. The Colombian government, while a frequent critic of the Venezuelan administration, unequivocally condemned the violation of its territorial integrity. The presidential palace, the Casa de Nariño, issued a communiqué calling for an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council and demanding a thorough investigation. For Bogotá, the strike was a destabilizing act that not only violated international law, but also risked inflaming an already volatile border region, jeopardizing its own national security. Both nations, despite their differing political alignments, found common ground in their defense of a predictable, rules-based international system. Beyond the Americas, the attack drew sharp denunciation from major global powers who have consistently challenged the unipolar dominance of the United States. Russia, China, and Iran, all significant allies of Venezuela, framed the strike as an act of Western aggression and a textbook example of illegal interventionism. The Russian Foreign Ministry in Moscow issued a scathing statement, calling the attack a gross violation of the UN Charter, and warning of its potential to dangerously destabilize the situation in the region and beyond. Russian officials accused the perpetrators of undermining global security for their own geopolitical aims. In Beijing, the response was similarly severe. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs reiterated its firm opposition to the use of force in international relations and called for all parties to respect Venezuela's sovereignty and independence. Chinese diplomats emphasized their country's long-standing policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations, portraying the strike as a reckless act that flouted the basic principles of international conduct. Iran, another key partner for Caracas, condemned the attack in the strongest possible terms, labeling it an act of terrorism and a clear violation of national sovereignty. For these three nations, the incident was not only an attack on their ally, but also a direct challenge to their vision of a multipolar world order, one where the actions of powerful states are constrained by international law. Their coordinated condemnation served to solidify a geopolitical counter-narrative, positioning them as defenders of sovereignty against Western overreach. The European Union, while often critical of the Venezuelan government, also expressed grave concern. The EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy issued a statement from Brussels emphasizing that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be respected. While stopping short of the fiery rhetoric used by Moscow or Beijing, the EU's message was unambiguous. Military solutions are unacceptable. The statement called for restraint and stressed the urgent need for a peaceful, political, and democratic resolution to the Venezuelan crisis, facilitated through dialogue and negotiation. Key member states like Germany, France, and Spain released their own statements, aligning with the collective EU position and reinforcing the call for adherence to international law. The European response highlighted a commitment to multilateralism and a deep-seated aversion to unilateral actions that could create dangerous precedents and undermine the global security architecture that the EU itself is built upon. In Washington, the official response was markedly different and far more nuanced. While most of the world condemned the act, the United States' initial statements were conspicuously cautious. The State Department spokesperson, in a carefully worded press briefing, neither condemned nor condoned the strike. Instead, the focus was placed on the destabilizing activities of the Venezuelan government itself, framing the broader context as one of regional insecurity for which Caracas allegedly bore responsibility. The White House remained largely silent in the first 24 hours, a move widely interpreted by analysts as a strategic ambiguity. This calculated reticence stood in stark contrast to the immediate and vocal reactions from other world capitals. It fueled speculation about the extent of prior knowledge or even tacit approval of the operation. Behind the scenes, American diplomats were reportedly engaged in intense consultations with allies, particularly in Latin America, attempting to manage the diplomatic fallout and prevent a unified bloc of condemnation from solidifying against its interests. The American position was a delicate balancing act, trying to maintain pressure on the Venezuelan government without appearing to endorse a violation of sovereignty that alienated its regional partners and violated the very international norms it often claims to uphold. At the heart of the global system, the United Nations became the central forum for the world's response. Secretary General Antonio Guterres was among the first to react, issuing a statement through his spokesperson that expressed deep concern over the events. He unequivocally warned that such unilateral uses of force are a violation of the United Nations Charter and could set a dangerous global precedent. Guterres reminded all member states of their obligation to settle international disputes by peaceful means, emphasizing that any use of force is permissible only in self-defense against an armed attack or when authorized by the Security Council. His statement was a powerful defense of the post-World War II legal order, a system designed specifically to prevent such actions. The Secretary General's words carried the weight of the institution, serving as a clear reminder that the international community had established rules to govern the use of force and that these rules had been broken. He urged for immediate de-escalation and a return to diplomacy, cautioning that the incident risked igniting a wider conflict with catastrophic humanitarian consequences. The UN headquarters in New York quickly became the epicenter of diplomatic efforts to contain the crisis, as missions from around the world prepared for an emergency session of the Security Council, where the deep divisions of global politics would be laid bare.
An assault on sovereignty cannot be justified.
As the dust settles on the intervention, Venezuela faces a deeply uncertain future. The removal of its longtime leader has not brought immediate stability, but instead a precarious power vacuum. On the streets of Caracas, the mood is a tense mix of hope and apprehension as citizens grapple with the daily realities of a nation in flux. The regional response has been fractured. While some neighboring countries have cautiously welcomed the change, others have condemned the intervention, raising alarms at the Organization of American States and the United Nations. The United States asserts its goal is to help stabilize the country and restore democracy. But critics, both domestic and international, fear this rhetoric masks a strategy of occupation, aimed at controlling Venezuela's vast oil reserves and securing a strategic foothold in the region. The humanitarian crisis, already severe, hangs in the balance. Crippling sanctions continue to impact the general population, and while aid corridors are being discussed, the flow of refugees into neighboring countries shows no sign of slowing. Internally, the security situation remains volatile. The loyalty of the military is divided, and the presence of armed paramilitary groups, or colectivos, adds a dangerous and unpredictable element to the political landscape, particularly along the country's porous borders. This intervention has ignited a fierce debate over the principles of international law, pitting national sovereignty against the doctrine of responsibility to protect. Analysts are now split on the long-term outcomes. Some foresee a path toward a transitional government and free elections, while others predict a prolonged stalemate, or worse, a descent into civil conflict. The path forward will depend on delicate diplomacy, the establishment of credible election timelines, and the willingness of all parties to de-escalate. What began as military pressure on alleged drug trafficking has become one of the most controversial foreign interventions of the decade, reshaping geopolitics in the Americas and setting a precedent that will be debated for years to come.